Brother Rick, and welcome back to Everyday Saints. It is always so good to be talking about the Book of Mormon. Last week, we spent some time in the introductory pages to the Book of Mormon. The title page is written by Moreau and I around 420 AD. The introduction, as written by Bruce R. McConkie and first published in 1981. And we spent a lot of time with the witness statements, the statement of the 3 witnesses, and the statement of the 8 witnesses, and we focused on their experience and their testimony. Between those 11 men and 10, potentially 11 others, we have well over 200 individual statements testifying of the physical reality of the gold plates. From a historical standpoint, with that much testimony, it is undeniable that the gold plates existed and in the year 1829 were in the possession of Joseph Smith. Each of those 21 individuals went to their grave knowing that they had seen the plates. The 3 witnesses, having heard God testify to them that the translation was correct, went to their graves knowing that the Book of Mormon was true, despite periods of their life when they were extremely hostile towards Joseph Smith and the church. The 3 witnesses, having heard the voice of God testify to them that the translation was correct, went to their graves knowing that the Book of Mormon was true. Each of those 3 men at one point were excommunicated. 2 of them returned. David Whitmer did not return, but reaffirmed his testimony of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon and the physical reality of the gold plates at least 70 times. Those are the 70 times that exist within the historical record. These witnesses are extremely important from a historical standpoint. But more important than their witness is our own personal witness. Just as one of the 8 witnesses later lost faith in the translation of the record, but never the physical reality of the record, seeing the gold plates does not a convert make. True conversion comes from the Spirit. If we truly want to come closer to our Savior Jesus Christ through the Book of Mormon, we need to dive into its pages. We need to read it. And most importantly, we need to pray and ask God if it is true. In this podcast, we will spend a lot of time looking at the Book of Mormon from multiple angles. We will look at it from a linguistics angle. We will look at it from a historical angle. And those angles are fascinating, but they are not what is truly important. Our beloved prophet Russell M. Nelson has said that our study of the Book of Mormon is most beneficial when we focus on its message of Jesus Christ. He has also said that the Book of Mormon is an extremely effective tool in bringing others, including ourselves, closer to Jesus Christ. I know this is something I have definitely seen within my own life. And I hope that as we study the Book of Mormon together this year, that all of us will be able to mutually come closer to our Savior. This week we're studying from the book of 1 Nephi, the first 5 chapters, getting into the text. And this is such a great part of the Book of Mormon that I think we often take for granted. We've read it so many times that we just kind of glance over it at this point. But there is so much goodness just in these first few pages of the Book of Mormon that oftentimes we just skip right past because we are so familiar with it that we lose some of that importance and some of that goodness that is found within these pages. Most of the book of 1 Nephi, the first 19 chapters, are written from a retrospective point of view. Nephi is writing these events years after they occurred. When he begins writing, he has already arrived on the American continent. He has been made a king over a group of people who are unfamiliar with the ways of Jerusalem. He has built a city and a temple and is trying to help his people come closer to their Savior. And he is writing this record for their benefit as well as ours. If a person has only memorized a single verse from the Book of Mormon, there is a very good chance that it is the first verse. 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 1. We've all heard it a million times. It starts out, I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents. In my opinion, that's right up there with Call Me Ishmael. It is such a great way to start a literary work. But the significance of these words is often lost on us in the 21st century. This introduction of I, Nephi, with a reference to his father and also to deity, places this simple introduction to the text as an evidence of its ancient origin. We see similar introductions in the writing of Yahamuk and Panamua and also Azatiwara. These are ancient Semitic kings with very similar introductions in ancient writings. We have not even made it past the first verse of the Book of Mormon, and already we are seeing evidence for its ancient origin and its Semitic roots. There are many people who try and push the Book of Mormon aside. They try to ignore the many evidences that exist for the authenticity of this text. But this book is true. It is an ancient record. These people did exist, and the events that we will read about in the coming year did actually happen. That is my testimony that I have had since I was a young boy. I have not leaned on my parents' testimony in many, many years. But while these physical evidences have helped me through some difficult moments, my true testimony of the Book of Mormon comes from the Spirit. Have you noticed a recurring theme here? Evidence does not a convert make. True conversion comes from the Spirit. I've said it once, and I will say it again, because it bears repeating. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to talk about the historical aspect of the Book of Mormon, because that aspect of it is fascinating, and it helps us better understand these ancient people. As we discussed last week, the purpose of the Book of Mormon is to the convincing of Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God. That's the purpose of the Book of Mormon. And Nephi makes this very clear as he begins his record. At this point, he's keeping two sets of plates, what we now call the small plates and the large plates. At this point in the Book of Mormon, we are reading from the small plates, which Nephi used to focus on the spiritual aspects. And he lets us know this here in the very first verse. Nephi begins his record saying, I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents, therefore I was taught somewhat in all the learning of my fathers. And this is the part we need to pay attention to. And having seen many afflictions in the course of my days, nevertheless, having been highly favored of the Lord in all my days, yea, and having a great knowledge of the goodness and the mysteries of God, therefore I make a record of my proceedings in my days. Nephi is no stranger to struggle. He has been through the refiner's fire. But he has noticed throughout his life that God has helped him many times. And we will see that in the coming chapters. And Nephi, as he is writing this record, both for the people of his kingdom and for the modern day, he makes a point to focus on those times when the Lord helped them on their journey. So as we read through these coming chapters, I want us to pay attention to the goodness and the mysteries of God and the way God helped Nephi and his family as they traveled through the wilderness. Nephi then, continuing to provide exposition for this record that he is beginning to make, writes, "Yea, I make a record in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians." Today in the church, we call this Reformed Egyptian, as that is what Mormon and Moroni called it later on within the text of the Book of Mormon. Many outside the church and those who have left the church will use this as a source of mockery and claim that no such language exists. Within the historical record, there exist many examples of ancient Hebrew speakers who wrote using Egyptian hieratics. Scholar David Calabro, who is not a member of the church, writes of this phenomenon and calls it the hieratic scribal tradition in pre-exilic Judah. Pre-exilic Judah is the time in which Lehi and Nephi left Jerusalem. The exile refers to that of the Babylonians, which will happen a few years after their departure. Pot shards and even metal plates have been found in the Near East using this ancient language. Reformed Egyptian is a very real historical phenomenon that critics of the church do not like to admit is a real thing. Just because scholars do not call it Reformed Egyptian does not mean that it did not exist as an ancient language. In the early history of the modern church, Joseph Smith copied a series of characters from the golden plates onto a piece of paper. This was used as a missionary tract. Missionaries would go and say, "Let me tell you about this fantastic new book that has been translated from ancient records. The characters on the plates look like this," and it would be used as something to gain people's interest and get them wanting to learn more about the Book of Mormon. Sometimes we confuse this document with the Anthon transcript, but based on descriptions of that document, we know that this is not, in fact, the Anthon transcript, because the Anthon transcript had, at the very least, a translation to go along with the characters. This document is the largest sample we have of this language called Reformed Egyptian. Some individuals will try and claim that these characters are not Reformed Egyptian, but are deformed English, and will then take them and twist them in other directions to try and demonstrate that they are simply English alphabet characters. But if one really wanted to, we could do that with the alphabet of any other language that utilizes other characters. Some individuals will try and claim that Joseph Smith simply made up these characters. He was just scribbling on the page. But that doesn't account for the very clear and obvious connection of those characters to ancient Egyptian hieratics. This document actually utilizes ancient Egyptian numerals that are also found in Mayan writings. Many of the other characters that are here as well are also found in Egyptian hieratic and Mayan writings. And we actually have found some of these same characters in American writings. The Xochicalco Celestone, found in modern-day Moreno, Mexico, or at least near there, contains several of the characters that are found within this document. Jerry Grover, who has some background in Egyptian writing, spent a lot of time with this document, and he noticed these multiple numbers that were found within this document. And working from there, he was able to translate the entirety of it, using primarily ancient Egyptian hieratics. There are some other languages involved to come up with his translation, including some Mayan characters. Within the document are multiple dates that line up perfectly with the Book of Mormon. The first part of this document, translated, actually reads as a summary or an introduction to the Book of Mosiah, as we see with many of the books within the Book of Mormon. And it tells us of the events that lead up to what we now read as Mosiah chapter 1. Some of this we know from the Book of Omni, as he is summarizing what has happened among his people. But there's also a little more detail there as well. The second part is actually a prophetic calendar, which also lines up perfectly with the dates within the Book of Mormon. If you're interested in this, I highly recommend you go and read translation of the Characters document by Jerry Grover. It's free on his website, bmslr.org. If you're a nerd like me and you're into this kind of stuff, it's a fantastic read. But it would be near impossible to read this book that Jerry Grover has put together and come away thinking that the characters on this document are not of ancient Egyptian origin. As much as critics try and claim that there is no evidence of the Book of Mormon, I have found that as I have studied this aspect of the Book of Mormon more and more, I found that in order to maintain that idea takes a lot of willful ignorance and cognitive dissonance. There is so much evidence for the Book of Mormon. We are only 2 verses in, and already I've spent a lot of time talking about these evidences that exist for the things we are reading about within the text. But now we're going to begin to make a shift, at least for the time being, and focus on the more spiritual things, because there are some very spiritually impactful events that are going to be happening in the coming verses. In the latter days, today, we have the Old Testament. His people had the brass plates. Nephi, as a king and a spiritual leader of his people, wanted to instill in them a spiritual heritage. He wanted them to look back in their history and see that it was God that had placed them where they were. We are encouraged to liken the scriptures unto ourselves. And we see a lot of this in Nephi's writings. Just as Moses led the exodus from Egypt, Lehi is leading the exodus from Jerusalem. Nephi is almost pointing out these parallels between his own story and those we read about in the books of Moses. Nephi is writing this at least 30 years after these events occurred. And he makes a point to write here, "And I know that the record which I make is true, and I make it with mine own hand, and I make it according to my knowledge." Nephi is going to share some very miraculous experiences that he is sharing with his people, letting them know where their fathers came from, instilling within them a spiritual history, if you will. The Nephites, hundreds of years later, would look to the story of Lehi and Nephi leaving Jerusalem the same way that the Jews today look at the exodus of Moses from Egypt. This history becomes a part of their identity, and Nephi wants them to know that it is true. He experienced these things, and he is writing them as he remembers. At many points, likening the scriptures, he quotes substantially from the book of Isaiah, and also draws some parallels to the books of Moses. At this point, it is about 600 years before the birth of Christ, the first year of the reign of King Zedekiah. Historically, this would be shortly after what is called the Josiah reforms or the Deuteronomist reforms. And many changes had been made to the way that the Jews worshipped in the temples. Nephi tells us that there were many prophets in Jerusalem. Among them would have been the prophet Jeremiah, whom we read about in the Bible. And they were prophesying that if the people did not repent, Jerusalem would be destroyed. Nephi's father Lehi went and prayed to the Lord in behalf of the people of Jerusalem, and there appeared before him a pillar of fire which dwelt upon a rock. There's a parallel here between the burning bush, which was seen by Moses, and the pillar of fire, which protected the Israelites. One account of Joseph Smith's first vision recalls that the young Joseph expected the trees to begin to burn. This light, as we are used to calling it, also had the appearance of fire. We know that within this light, Joseph Smith saw Jesus Christ as well as God the Father. It is my belief that Moses, within the burning bush, also saw the Messiah. I believe that Lehi also saw his Savior within the pillar of fire, which dwelt upon a rock. Nephi writes that his father saw and heard much, and it caused him to quake and tremble exceedingly. The writings of Lehi are not currently available to us, and I imagine that there are some wonderful truths that were revealed to Lehi at this time. I personally believe that what we call the 116 lost pages may have been lost for a reason. I have wondered if some of the things that were written in what we call the lost 116 pages, especially those written by the prophet Lehi in regards to this vision, may not have been intended to be revealed yet. We know that that was a portion of the large plates which kept a more political record. So it's likely that there would have been more detail in regards to how the civilization of the Nephites began to spread. I do think that if we had that record, as we've continued to learn more about ancient America, the parallels which would be seen would be undeniable even by scholars and critics. I think that this would allow people to lean too much on the physical evidence and not the spiritual witness. I think for that reason it was necessary for that portion to be lost. But I also wonder if some of the writings of Lehi and perhaps other prophets were not yet meant to be revealed. Perhaps there was some truth in those lost pages recorded by Lehi, perhaps from this vision, that are not meant to be revealed to us until the millennium. Perhaps the Lord used the error of Joseph Smith to once again conceal that portion of the record. After Lehi had seen and heard much in this pillar of fire, he was overcome by the Spirit and returned to his home and laid down. We see a similar thing happening with Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith tells us that his earlier spiritual experiences of this magnitude left him spiritually drained. Later in life, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon shared a spiritual experience, and afterwards, Sidney Rigdon was left very weak. And Joseph Smith, in both humility and a little humor, said, "Sidney is not as used to it as I am." Physical exhaustion after spiritual experiences of this magnitude is not uncommon. And I think this is what Nephi is referring to when he says he cast himself upon his bed, being overcome with the Spirit and the things which he had seen. I believe that Lehi was physically exhausted after conversing with the Lord in a pillar of fire. But then, in his exhaustion, laying in his bed, he was thus overcome with the Spirit and was carried away in a vision. He has already seen a pillar of fire. I believe within that pillar of fire he also saw his Savior. But then he has a vision. And in this vision he sees the heavens open. And he sees God sitting on his throne, surrounded by numberless concourses of angels. And descending out of heaven, he sees a man, and he writes that his luster was above that of the sun at noonday. This man was followed by 12 others. I think we can infer who that individual was and who those 12 followers were. And the first came and gave Lehi a book and told him that he should read. And as he read, he was filled with the Spirit. And he said, "Woe, woe unto Jerusalem, for I have seen thine abominations." According to Nephi, his father read many things about the wickedness of Jerusalem, and that they would be destroyed by the sword at the hand of the Babylonians. This would begin to happen in the year 587 BC. This is one of those times where I wonder just what else Lehi saw within this vision. And I wonder how much more was written in Lehi's own record or within Nephi's writing in the large plates. Because immediately after Nephi is writing that his father had seen the destruction of Jerusalem and that many of the inhabitants of that city would be carried captive into Babylon, his father says, "Great and marvelous are thy works, O Lord God Almighty. Thy throne is high in the heavens, and thy power and goodness and mercy are over all the inhabitants of the earth. And because thou art merciful, thou wilt not suffer that those who come unto thee, that they shall perish." After witnessing the destruction of the city, where Lehi had spent his entire life, among a people who he knew and loved, he saw their destruction, he saw their wickedness. But then he praises the mercifulness of the Lord. Do we have the same spiritual resilience that when we see things or we experience things that we think are unfair, that we can still recognize the mercy that the Lord has and has extended to us? In the next few verses, Nephi writes that his father had seen and heard much and had visions and prophesied, and that his father had written these things. These visions would have been included in the lost text from the large plates. After Lehi had had these spiritual experiences, these visions, Lehi went out among the people and began to preach and prophesy to them about the things which he had seen and heard in this vision. He told them of the words which he had read from the book, which he had been handed, which told of the coming of the Messiah and the redemption of the world. Sadly, the hearts of the people of Jerusalem were hard. They did not understand the prophecies that Lehi made or the prophecies made by previous prophets regarding the Messiah. And they sought to take his life. They tried to kill him and stone him the way they had already killed and stoned other prophets. So far within this story, Nephi has been relaying the experiences of his father. His father had a vision. His father witnessed the awful destruction and captivity of the people of Jerusalem. His father continued to praise the Lord. These are both blessings and hardships that his father has experienced. If you'll remember, Nephi began by writing that he had a knowledge of the goodness and the mysteries of God. As we now end the first chapter of the Book of Mormon, Nephi writes, "But behold, I, Nephi, will show unto you that the tender mercies of the Lord are over all those whom he hath chosen, because of their faith, to make them mighty, even unto the power of deliverance." So far, Nephi has been telling us the story of his father, who had a vision in which he saw the destruction and captivity of Jerusalem. Despite everything he had seen and heard within this vision, Lehi continues to praise the Lord and thanks him for their many blessings. Lehi then follows the commandment of the Lord and goes out and tells the people of Jerusalem the things which he had seen and heard. People do not like being corrected. They do not like being told they are wrong. And they do not like being told they are wicked. And the people of Jerusalem sought to take his life. God knew that this was going to happen. I believe that this was a trial of faith that Lehi needed to go through. To have a spiritual experience, especially one of that magnitude, and then go and tell others about it takes a great deal of faith. And I believe that our Heavenly Father was testing Lehi's faith at that point. Because after he has the vision in which he sees the destruction of Jerusalem, he goes and tells the people that this is going to happen. They try and take his life. It is only then that he has another vision, which we read about in chapter 2 of 1 Nephi. We read that Lehi had a dream, and the Lord spoke to him, saying, "Blessed art thou, Lehi, because of the things which thou hast done, and because thou hast been faithful, and declared unto this people the things which I commanded thee. Behold, they seek to take away thy life." God tells Lehi that he is blessed because he was faithful to the commandment the Lord had given him. The immediate response to him keeping that commandment was not a positive. It would be very easy to look at what was going on around him, for Lehi to say, "I followed this commandment of the Lord, and now the people are trying to kill me." It would be very easy to look at that from a negative point of view. But because Lehi was faithful, he is blessed. The Lord then commanded Lehi to take his family and depart into the wilderness. Lehi was a very wealthy person, but at the commandment of the Lord, he left his home, he left his precious metals, he left all of his worldly belongings, and took only what they needed and departed into the wilderness. I may have said earlier that I believe that Lehi was a merchant. This would explain his knowledge of Egyptian and also his financial status. There are some scholars who believe that Lehi may have been the namesake of the city near Jerusalem named Bethlehem. I myself tend to side with BYU scholar Lamar Barrett and think that it is unlikely that there is a connection between the Lehi of the Book of Mormon and the city and the cave of Bethlehem. It is, however, a very interesting point of study. To me, it seems far more likely from the scriptural and archaeological record that Lehi's wealth and status came primarily, if not solely, from trading as a merchant and traveling, and perhaps also metalworking. I do believe very strongly that Nephi was involved in metalworking as a trade. I do not know if he inherited that trade from his father or not. But Nephi is very passionate about metalworking, and that becomes very obvious in the coming chapters. But with all this wealth that Lehi has, he leaves all of it. He takes nothing with him except his family and the things they need to survive. Lehi takes his family and they depart into the wilderness. They camp near the borders of the Red Sea and from there travel 3 days southward, where they come to a large valley with a river of water. Here Lehi builds an altar and he offers a sacrifice to give thanks unto the Lord. I think it is so interesting that Lehi continues to give thanks to the Lord in spite of everything he has been through up to this point. He has witnessed in vision the destruction of the city in which he lived. The people of that city attempted to kill him. He then took his family, leaving all of his worldly possessions, and traveled at this point at least 3 days in the wilderness. And yet he still gives thanks to the Lord. Do we have that same level of gratitude ourselves? If you're familiar with arid regions like those surrounding Jerusalem, you'll know that there are very few rivers that flow year-round. Nephi, in this account, makes a point to tell us that this river was continually flowing into the Red Sea. And Lehi names this river Laman. And he explains his purpose in this name as he is speaking to his son Laman. He says, "Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this river, continually flowing into the fountain of all righteousness." He sees the valley that is surrounding them, and he calls it Lemuel, and speaking to his son of the same name, says, "Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this valley, firm and steadfast, and immovable in keeping the commandments of God." Now, Laman and Lemuel were not walking in the ways of the Lord. They are described as stiff-necked at this point. They are quick to murmur and complain against the commandments of the Lord. Nephi tells us that they murmured and said that their father was a visionary man, and he had led them out of the land of Jerusalem to leave their inheritance, and their gold and their silver and their precious things to perish in the wilderness. They felt that their father had led them away from Jerusalem, from all their worldly things, because of the foolish imaginations of his heart. Nephi here makes a point to say, "And they did murmur because they knew not the dealings of God who had created them." Lehi had given thanks in spite of his blessings, but Laman and Lemuel continued to complain. I think there is a very obvious lesson here about gratitude in spite of everything we go through. Nephi, Lehi, and their family, they are going through it, and they will continue to go through it for at least the next 8 years. I know that all of us have our own personal trials. We have our own wilderness that we must get through. But we have a choice. Will we be like Lehi and give thanks unto God for the blessings that we do have? Or will we be like Laman and Lemuel and complain and focus only on the negative things? Nephi mentions that Laman and Lemuel were like unto the Jews at Jerusalem, who sought to take away the life of their father. This may imply that they were Deuteronomist, and they believed that the Josiah reforms were of God. These reforms altered temple worship, they changed scripture, and they called for the death of anyone who taught differently. Verse 14 is one of those instances where I wish we had the record of the large plates. I believe that the writings of Lehi would probably contain some of the words that this verse refers to. Nephi wrote, "And it came to pass that my father did speak unto them in the valley of Lemuel with power, being filled with the Spirit, until their frames did shake before him, and he did confound them, that they durst not utter against him. Wherefore they did as he commanded them." Here their father has chastened them by the Spirit so much that their frames did quake. Going forward, we will see a pattern with Laman and Lemuel. This is the first of many instances where Laman and Lemuel are chastened by the Spirit through one of the Lord's mouthpieces, by an angel, by the physical power of God, and yet they continually return to their wickedness. I wish we had even a portion of the words which Lehi spoke to Laman and Lemuel in this instance. Let's sidestep for a moment and talk about the Valley of Lemuel. This is one location of several during Lehi's journey that we can say with a fair amount of certainty where it is located physically. Most faithful scholars agree that the Valley of Lemuel is a location known as Wadi Tayyib al-Isam. If I mispronounce that, you're going to have to forgive me. But this location fits the description of the Book of Mormon perfectly. It has beautiful cliffs which could easily be described as steadfast and immovable. And it is one of very few rivers in the area that continually flows into the Red Sea. We also know that Lehi and his family traveled 3 days from the northern borders of the Red Sea. Wadi Tayyib al-Isam is the correct distance if we account for the average speed of a caravan traveling in that area. There are many areas in this valley that would be an idyllic place to camp along this river that Lehi called Laman. It's implied that they stayed here for some time. Nephi wrote, "My father dwelt in a tent." Nephi describes himself as being exceedingly young. We don't know how young this is, but we know from later on that he has some experience in working with metal. So he's been involved at least in some sort of apprenticeship up to that age. But at that time, apprenticeships started very young, so that doesn't help us narrow it down very much. He also says that he is large in stature. In the coming chapters, we will see that physically he is able to pass as a grown man, and it has the strength to physically stop another grown man from fleeing. So Nephi is a large person. I anticipate he is probably around 16 or 17, or a very large and very mature 14 or 15-year-old. It is at this young age that Nephi writes he had a great desire to know the mysteries of God. And he writes that he cried unto the Lord, and behold, he did visit me. He writes that his heart was softened, and he believed the words of his father. And he did not rebel against his father like his brothers did. Now, I don't believe that there was any threat of Nephi rebelling against his father. But I think he is trying to point out that the softness of his heart came from the Lord. We also know that Nephi saw many things, and he taught them to his brother Sam, who believed the things that he had seen. It's another one of those instances where perhaps there is quite a bit more in those lost 116 pages. It would be wonderful to know what Nephi saw and heard in this, his first encounter with the Lord. He tries to tell Laman and Lemuel the things that he had learned in this vision. And of course, they did not believe him. And Nephi feels for them, and he cries to the Lord in their behalf. And the Lord spoke to him and said, "Blessed art thou, Nephi, because of thy faith. For thou hast sought me diligently with lowliness of heart. And inasmuch as ye shall keep my commandments, ye shall prosper, and be led to a land of promise, yea, even a land which I have prepared for you, yea, a land which is choice above all other lands. And inasmuch as thy brethren rebel against thee, they shall be cut off from the presence of the Lord. And inasmuch as thou shalt keep my commandments, thou shalt be made a ruler and a teacher over thy brethren. For behold, in that day that they shall rebel against me, I will curse them even with a sore curse, that they will not have power over thee. For behold, in that day that they shall rebel against me, I will curse them even with a sore curse, and they will have no power over thy seed, except they shall rebel against me also. And if it so be that they shall rebel against me, they shall be a scourge unto thy seed, to stir them up in the ways of remembrance." These words will prove prophetic throughout the Book of Mormon. This is beginning to lay the groundwork with this prophecy of the warring nations of the Nephites and Lamanites. We are only 2 chapters in to the Book of Mormon, and already we have read of 4 different spiritual encounters. Both Lehi and Nephi saw the Lord. Lehi saw him in a pillar of fire. Nephi wrote that the Lord did visit him. Lehi had a vision in which he saw the destruction of Jerusalem. And the Lord spake unto Nephi concerning the blessing of his posterity. Chapter 3 begins with Nephi telling us that after he finished conversing with the Lord, he went to the tent of his father. And his father had also had a vision in which the Lord commanded him that he and his brothers needed to return to Jerusalem and obtain the brass plates. The brass plates were in the possession of a man named Laban. At this point in the text, we know of the brass plates that they contain the record of the Jews and a genealogy of Lehi's forefathers. Apparently, Lehi had already told Laman and Lemuel that they needed to return to Jerusalem. And of course, being Laman and Lemuel, they murmured, and they said that it was a hard thing that had been required of them. But Lehi knew that it was not he who was asking them to do it, but it was a commandment of the Lord. In verse 7, we get that famous verse in which Nephi says, I will go and do the things which the Lord hath commanded. For I know that the Lord giveth no commandment unto the children of men, save he shall prepare a way for them, that they may accomplish the thing which he commandeth them. So Nephi, Laman, Lemuel, and Sam take their tents, and they return to Jerusalem. Just from the borders of the Red Sea, it had taken their family 3 days to get to the valley of Lemuel. From Wadi Taib al-Isam to Jerusalem is about 260 miles, and they had to travel this on foot in order to get these plates. When they arrive at Jerusalem, they go to the house of Laban and they draw lots. Laman was the first to be selected, and he went to the house of Laban and he sat and talked with him and told him that he desired the brass plates. But Laban did not take this kindly and tried to kill him, calling him a robber. But Laman was able to escape, and he went and told his brothers what had happened. And Nephi wrote that his brethren were about to return to their father in the wilderness. But then Nephi speaks, saying, As the Lord liveth, and as we live, we will not go down unto our father in the wilderness, until we have accomplished the thing which the Lord hath commanded us. This level of faith that Nephi has is absolutely inspiring. He then suggests to his brothers that they go to their home and they collect their gold and their silver and all these precious things that they have and take them to the house of Laban and try and purchase the brass plates. Nephi tells his brethren and us in this record that the people of Jerusalem had rejected the words of the prophets. And he writes, It is wisdom in God that we should obtain these records, that we may preserve unto our children the language of our fathers, and also that we may preserve unto them the words which have been spoken by the mouth of all the holy prophets, which have been delivered unto them by the Spirit and power of God, since the world began, even down to this present time. These scriptures are very important to Nephi. And the importance of these brass plates will become even more evident in the coming chapters. So Nephi and his brothers, they collect all of these precious things, this gold and silver, and they go to the house of Laban and they present this offer. They want the brass plates, and they will give him all of this gold and silver. And Laban not only refuses their offer, but commands his servants to slay them. Of course, Nephi and his brothers flee and were not captured, but they have to leave behind all their precious things, and they dwell in the cavity of a rock. And it is in this cavity of a rock that Laman and Lemuel turn on their brother, and they begin to beat him with a stick. It was not long ago that Laman and Lemuel were chastened by the Spirit through their father, so much that their frames did shake. And they are about to have another such experience as they are beating and insulting Nephi and Sam. an angel appears to them and says, "Why do you smite your younger brother with a rod? Know ye not that the Lord hath chosen him to be a ruler over you, and this because of your iniquities? Behold, ye shall go up to Jerusalem again, and behold, the Lord will deliver Laban into your hands." This is twice that Laman and Lemuel within this record have been chastened by the Lord. But they do not have true conversion. They continue to turn back to wickedness. Because true conversion comes from the Spirit, not from the things that can be seen. In fact, immediately after the angel departs, Laman and Lemuel immediately begin to murmur once again, saying, "How is it that the Lord can deliver Laban into our hands? Behold, he can command 50, yea, he can slay 50. In chapter 4, Nephi again demonstrates his great faith, speaking to his brethren who had just been beating him with a rod. Says, "Let us go up again unto Jerusalem, and let us be faithful in keeping the commandments of the Lord. For behold, he is mightier than all the earth. Then why not mightier than Laban and his 50, yea, or even than his tens of thousands?" Laban was a military officer. He was a commander of 50. At times, he would be placed in charge of tens of thousands of soldiers. But Nephi knew that his God was mightier than Laban. And if God said that he would deliver Laban into his hands, then that is exactly what God would do. He then makes the connection to how God had delivered Moses and the Israelites from Egypt and from Pharaoh, and said to his brethren, "Ye know that this is true, and ye also know that an angel hath spoken unto you. Wherefore can you doubt? Let us go up. The Lord is able to deliver us, even as our fathers, and to destroy Laban, even as the Egyptians." Laman and Lemuel continue to murmur, but they do follow Nephi back to Jerusalem, where they hide outside the city walls. Under the cover of night, Nephi enters the city and goes to the house of Laban, where he finds Laban drunk and passed out. Nephi sees the sword of Laban and pulls it from its sheath and admires it. He notes that the hilt was made of pure gold, and that the blade was made of precious steel. He notes that the workmanship was exceedingly fine. I believe that it is Nephi's experience working with metal that caused him to make such notes about the workmanship of this weapon. The mention of the blade being made of precious steel has given pause to some people. This has been considered an anachronism, as many people did not think that steel had yet been invented in 600 BC. But not far from Jerusalem, in a set of ruins called Jericho, they actually discovered a sword dating to about 650 BC that was actually made of steel. Some have tried to say that this Jericho sword is not actually steel but simply iron, but they fail to understand that all steel is iron, but with carbon added. And carbon has been found in x-rays of this sword, and it has been determined that this sword, found at Jericho dating to 650 BC, is indeed made of mild steel with carbon intentionally added. Beyond that, the maker of this sword intentionally added more carbon to the blade than to the hilt, knowing that the blade would require extra strength, where the hilt would be reinforced. So what was once thought to be an anachronism with this steel sword of Laban in 600 BC in Jerusalem has now been historically verified, adding plausibility to the Book of Mormon. Now, of course, one artifact does not prove the Book of Mormon, nor should it. Nor should one's testimony rely on artifacts. But one has to ask themselves, if the Book of Mormon was truly written by Joseph Smith or one of his 1829 rural New York counterparts, how on earth could any of those men guess correctly the hundreds of times, as evidenced here by the steel sword of Laban and its Verita Jericho sword counterpart? In 1829, nobody would have known that steel swords existed in Jerusalem in 600 BC. One's testimony should not lie in artifacts. It should lie in the spirit. Evidence does not a convert make. But I really wish that critics would stop spreading the lie that there is no evidence for the Book of Mormon, because there is so much evidence. As Nephi is admiring the sword and its workmanship and craftsmanship, he is constrained by the Spirit and is told that he should kill Laban. And Nephi, understandably, is confused by this. He's never killed anyone. He knows that the law says that he should not kill. He's not going into this predetermined to kill Laban. He is hesitating. Nephi is one to go and do. And if the Spirit tells him to do something, he's going to do it. But here, he is hesitating because this is a contradiction to what he knows. In Nephi's words, he says, "And I shrunk and would that I might not slay him." He did not want to slay Laban. But the Spirit says to him that the Lord had delivered him into thy hands. And Nephi remembered that Laban had first tried to kill them, and he had stolen their property. This is the only time within the record of Nephi that a commandment of the Spirit has to be repeated. And the Spirit says to him again, "Slay him, for the Lord hath delivered him into thy hands. Behold, the Lord slayeth the wicked to bring forth his righteous purposes. It is better that one man should perish than a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief." Later on in the Book of Mormon, we'll read of the people of Zarahemla, who did not bring records with them, and they fell away from the truth. They did not know how to write, as the Nephites did. This record that Nephi is about to obtain is of great spiritual importance to his posterity. And he remembers the words of the Lord when he spoke to him, saying that inasmuch as thy seed shall keep my commandments, they shall prosper in the land. And Nephi reasons that how can they keep the commandments if they do not know the commandments? They have to have the scriptures. They have to be able to read the commandments if they want to truly follow the word of God. Nephi writes, "I knew that the Lord had delivered Laban into my hands for this cause, that I might obtain the records according to his commandments. Therefore I did obey the voice of the Spirit, and took Laban by the hair of his head, and I smote off his head with his own sword." I want to re-emphasize here that Nephi did not want to slay Laban. He was commanded of the Lord to do it. As the Spirit said to him, "The Lord slayeth the wicked to bring about his righteous purposes." Throughout Scripture, especially the Old Testament, there are many people who die, who are slain by the Lord. In this instance, Nephi was a tool being utilized by the Lord to bring about his righteous purposes. And the purposes of the Lord in this instance were to ensure that Nephi's posterity had the brass plates, had Scripture, so that they could keep the commandments of God. Nephi then puts on the clothes of Laban and Laban's sword and goes to the treasury, where he finds Zoram, a servant of Laban, who has the keys to the treasury. Zoram, seeing Nephi dressed in Laban's clothes and wearing Laban's sword, supposes that Nephi is indeed Laban. The fact that it was night probably helped in this instance, and I can imagine that Nephi would have kept his words to a minimum. Zoram is the one doing most of the talking, as he is talking to the person he thinks is Laban about the elders of the Jews whom Laban had been out by night among, presumably at a Passover feast. And Nephi tells Zoram that he wants to take the brass plates and carry them to his elder brethren outside the city. And Zoram just expects that this is the brethren of the church and not his actual biological elder brethren. And so Zoram and Nephi take the brass plates and they go outside the walls of the city. Laman, Lemuel, and Sam, seeing Nephi dressed in Laban's clothing, wearing Laban's sword, accompanied by Laban's servant, begin to run away because they think he is indeed Laban. And Nephi calls out to them, telling them that he is indeed their brother. And then Zoram, realizing he's been duped, is about to run away himself because the person who he thought was Laban was actually Nephi. But Nephi stops him, and they enter into a covenant. Nephi tells him that if he would hearken unto my words, as the Lord liveth, and as I live, even so that if he would hearken unto our words, we would spare his life. Nephi tells us that he spoke unto him even with an oath that he need not fear, and that he should be a free man like unto us if he would go down into the wilderness with us. He then explains that the Lord had commanded them to retrieve the brass plates, and told him that if he would go into the wilderness with us, he would have a place in their family. Now Nephi knew that if they allowed Zoram to return to Jerusalem, he would let people know that they had left, what they had done, and that they would have more people to worry about pursuing them into the wilderness. They would be under further threat of death if they allowed Zoram to return. So it was imperative that Zoram come with them at this point. But Zoram returns the oath and tells them that he will tarry with them into the wilderness. And Zoram and Nephi actually become very good friends. After Zoram made this oath with Nephi, they were no longer afraid of any negative repercussions and returned to their father in the wilderness. Nephi and his brothers at this point had been gone much longer than had been expected. His parents likely knew it would take them some time to travel back to Jerusalem and then return to the wilderness, but they might not have anticipated it taking them 3 attempts in order to obtain the plates. They also had to take some time to gather up their worldly possessions from their home to take them to Laban. So we don't know exactly how long this whole process took, but it was long enough that their mother became very worried about their welfare. Sariah begins to let her fear and doubt get the best of her, and she begins to complain against her husband and perhaps even lose some faith in the Lord. Nephi wrote, "For she had supposed that we had perished in the wilderness, and she had also complained against my father, telling him that he was a visionary man, saying, Behold, thou hast led us forth from the land of our inheritance, and now my sons are no more, and we perish in the wilderness." The love and concern of a mother are something that I will never fully understand. But at this point, she had allowed her own doubt to convince her that her sons were dead. I know people who have lost children, and I know that that is a very devastating experience. Her sons, however, were not dead, but she lacked faith at that moment. Lehi, however, continued to have faith, and he said, "I know that I am a visionary man, for if I had not seen the things of God in a vision, I should not have known the goodness of God, but would have tarried in Jerusalem, and had perished with my brethren. For behold, I have obtained a land of promise, in the which things I do rejoice. Yea, I know that the Lord will deliver my sons out of the hands of Laban, and bring them down again unto us in the wilderness." When Nephi and his brethren finally return to the tent of their father, Sariah's faith returns, and she says, "Now I know of a surety that the Lord hath commanded my husband to flee into the wilderness. Yea, and also I know of a surety that the Lord hath protected my sons, and delivered them out of the hands of Laban, and hath given them power whereby they could accomplish the things which the Lord hath commanded them. Lehi had faith because of his spiritual experiences. He had had a vision. He had heard the voice of God. He had seen a pillar of fire. He likely had many other spiritual experiences which are not written about in the record. Sariah had not had these experiences. She likely had had some. She likely believed her husband when it was easy, but when it became hard, she began to doubt. But when her sons returned, her faith was restored, and she knew that it was the power of God that had protected them. Sometimes life gives us very difficult experiences. And at this point, Nephi and his family have gone through a few of those. How we handle those experiences can vary from person to person. And we see that within Nephi's family. Laman and Lemuel, they murmur, they complain. They don't follow the commandments of the Lord. Nephi is faithful. He goes and he does. Lehi is firm in the faith. Sariah, when things looked bleak, her faith began to waver. I think it's interesting that we see such a spectrum within this family. I don't think this is uncommon for any family. I think many of us have family members who, like Laman and Lemuel, have or will fall away. Many of us have probably had moments where, like Sariah, our faith wavered. We've probably had moments like Nephi, where we wanted to go and do, but the thing we were commanded to go and do wasn't something that made immediate sense to us. What I think is important is that when we have those very hard, difficult moments, where maybe like Sariah, we begin to doubt, I think it's important that we know where to turn. Sariah turned to Lehi, who comforted her. We can always turn to the Lord. We can always pray for understanding. We don't always immediately see the blessings that come from our trials, but for Nephi and his family in this instance, that was the case. Lehi offered burnt offerings unto the Lord in gratitude that his sons had returned and that they had brought the brass plates. And he searched the brass plates. He read the scriptures that he had, and he found that they contained the books of Moses and a record of the kings down to the time of Zedekiah, who we know had just entered his first year as king. We know that this record contained at least some of the words of Isaiah and another prophet named Zenos, not found in our current Old Testament. This record also contained a genealogy of Lehi's fathers, and he learned that he was a descendant of Joseph of Egypt, and that Laban also was a descendant of Joseph of Egypt. As Lehi reads this record of the brass plates, he is filled with the Spirit and with gratitude, and begins to prophesy concerning his seed, and says that this record will go forth among all nations and kindreds and tongues that were among his seed. At this point, we are only 5 chapters in to the Book of Mormon, and already there have been multiple spiritual experiences, visions, visitations of angels, the voice of the Spirit, and the voice of the Lord speaking to Nephi. Nephi, as he introduced himself, told us that he had seen many afflictions in the course of his days. And in these 5 chapters, we've seen a very small amount of those afflictions. but I believe we have definitely seen some of the goodness and the mysteries of God already within these first few pages of the Book of Mormon. As we continue to read, we will see even more afflictions of Nephi and his family. And alongside those afflictions, we will continue to see the Lord's blessings and the Lord's hand in their lives. Laman and Lemuel, even though they are just as directly affected by those blessings and by the hand of the Lord, they do not see it. It is my hope that as we experience our own afflictions in our own lives, we can see the accompanying hand of the Lord, and that we too may better understand the goodness and the mysteries of God. I hope that you have been spiritually and intellectually edified as we've studied the first 5 chapters of the Book of Mormon together today. I hope that you will continue to study on your own and that you will pray to better understand these things and apply them to your own lives. I love the story of Nephi, and we are going to continue with this story next week. There is so much good in Nephi's story. He tells us that he is going to show us the tender mercies of the Lord. And that is what he does all throughout his stories, despite those afflictions that he and his family experience. I hope that we too can recognize the Lord's tender mercies in our own lives.